Hello, everyone. This is the video to replace our class on Thursday. You may hear a little bit of noise in the background. Just ignore that. Um, so I hope to see you all on the 5th, which should be our first class. There may be some news about changing classrooms. We might move to a smart classroom. I'll just keep your eye on your email. And if you don't hear from me, then we are meeting in our regular classroom. And if you do, then you'll know that. Okay. So what I want to do in this video is just to continue where we left off. If you'll recall, we had talked about the killing of the bull of heaven, and then immediately following that, we saw that the gods get together and they discuss and they decide that one of the two, either Enkidu or Gilgamesh, has to die as punishment. Punishment for what? We discussed this a little bit last time. There isn't really a clear sense in which Enkidu and Gilgamesh have done something wrong, but there does seem to be this kind of ancient concept, which we see here kind of maybe in its first example, is that human beings, even if they are primarily, 2/3 God and 1/3 human, as Gilgamesh is, they cannot. There's a certain limit beyond which they cannot rise in terms of glory, or else, almost like like a law of nature, they have to fall again. I talked to in one of the classes. We talked about the myth of Icarus. Icarus is a Greek myth, but it has the same basic idea. The idea of a person who fashioned wings of wax, and then, of course, they flew too high, and the wax melted, and they fell. The ancient story of that doesn't have exactly the same moral as we tend to give it today, which is don't try to do too much or you will fall. Rather, for the ancients, it seemed, of course, you were supposed to try to rise as high as you possibly could, but don't be surprised that there will be some kind of a consequence. And that's what we see in the case of Gilgamesh. Even knowing the consequence, he wouldn't, and Enkidu, certainly they would have chosen again to do everything that they did. But the gods decide that at that moment, remember there was that one moment where Gilgamesh has kind of reached the highest peak of the potential for a human being, right? He has defeated Humbaba, he has defeated the Bull of Heaven, and more than that, he has defeated the vengeance of Ishtar, a goddess herself. So much so that we saw that the singing girls, right, the followers of Ishtar, in fact, praise Gilgamesh as the greatest of men. That's kind of his highest moment of glory. And then very next paragraph, we get this little scene in which the gods are discussing, saying that one of them must die. So it turns out that it is in fact Enkidu. He begins to immediately become sick. He lays in a bed and he complains. And then there's a series of kind of statements and then retractions of those statements by Enkidu. So he starts off, as soon as he knows that he is dying, he begins to curse everyone who brought him to the place that he is. We talked a little bit about this. He curses the trapper, and then he curses the harlot. The only important thing to recall there, or to notice there, is that when he curses the harlot, one of the last things he says, this reveals a little bit about the text, right? He says that it was for her sake that he left his wife in the forest, right? So we learned that Enkidu seemingly had a wife when he was in the forest. And in the second part where he praises the harlot, so essentially what happens there is he curses both of them, for putting him in the position where he is. And then he is reminded that it is they who have brought him to Gilgamesh. That the trapper and the harlot were instrumental in bringing him, humanizing him, and making him close to Gilgamesh. And they remind him that without them, he would have never had this companion. And so Enkidu changes, completely changes what he says, and begins to praise the trapper, right? And promising essentially to the trapper all the things that a trapper would want. And the same thing for the harlot, right? And then he, let's see, this is where Shamash reminds Enkidu of what he got from the harlot. So this is the last line of his praise then for the harlot. It says, "On your account, a wife, a mother of 7, was forsaken." So, I'm sure you were all surprised to read this if you even noticed it. The explanation I gave in class was essentially that the text that we read earlier and this piece of text are probably from different original stories, and so they are not really consistent. That's really the answer as to why here in this whole section we get the notion of an Enkidu who is a servant of Gilgamesh, who is an advisor, who is well experienced in battles, and now has a wife and also 7 children. Even before he supposedly ever had relations, right? Okay, so after praising the harlot, Enkidu continues to sicken and to die, and he has another dream, right? And this is really important because in last class I was talking about how what you mean by death, or what you think death is really determined by what you think happens after death, right? Death in itself is simply the end of life, but the significance of that depends upon what life will be like afterwards, whether it be nothing or what. So Enkidu has a dream about the afterlife, and here is what he says. It says, "It was I who cut down the cedar, I who leveled the forest, I who slew Humbaba, and now see what has become of me. Listen, my friend, this is the dream I dreamed last night. The heavens roared, the earth rumbled back in answer. Between them stood I before an awful being, a somber-faced man-bird. He had directed on me his purpose. He was a vampire face. His foot was a lion's foot. His hand was an eagle's talon. He fell on me, and his claws were in my hair. He held me fast, and I smothered. Then he transformed me so that my arms became wings covered with feathers. He turned his stare towards me and led me away into the palace of Irakala, the queen of darkness, to the house from which none who enters ever returns, down the road from which there is no coming back. There, in Irakala, there is a house whose people sit in darkness. The dust is their food, and clay is their meat. They are clothed like birds with wings for covering. They see no light, they sit in darkness. I entered the house of dust, and I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever, rulers and princes, all those who once wore kingly crowns, ruled the world in days of old. They who had stood in the place of the gods like Anu and Enlil stood now like servants to fetch baked meats in the house of dust, to carry cooked meat and cold water from the water skin. In the house of dust which I entered were high priests and acolytes, priests of the incantation and of ecstasy. There were servers of the temple, and there was Etana, that king of Kish, whom the eagles carried to heaven in the days of old, and so on and so forth, right? Other people he saw. what is significant about that passage? Well, and what does it tell us about the view of death that is involved in this text? First of all, notice how Enkidu opens up the story, right, or the dream. It was I who cut down the cedar, I who leveled the forest, I who slew Humbaba, and now see what has become of me. One of the things, well, a hypothesis, as it were, but I think it's a very good hypothesis and one that has been fairly well confirmed through my own reading, is that what really bothers, if you ask yourself, what really bothers Enkidu about death, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with a fear associated with pain or nothingness or not knowing what is to come or being torn from his friend. This doesn't seem to be it. What's wrong, what bothers him so much about death is that death is not glorious. Right? And we see that in this comparison. It was I who cut down the cedar. Now see what has become of me. Right? Now he is laying there, slowly dying, becoming sicker and sicker. And he's saying, look at how great I was. Now I am a pitiful human being, a sick person, right? And that's so that is a little hint here. Let's see if that holds up, if that is. Now, what is death like? It's this very strange place, right, where people are like birds. Everything is boring, tasteless. They eat dust. They eat clay. Everyone is clothed like birds. Who knows why? Everything is dark, right? And you cannot leave. You cannot. Once you enter the afterlife, you are there forever, right? In this depressing place. Now, there's a couple of other things besides it being depressing, and there being nothing to do. Notice there are a few really interesting details here. When he entered the house of dust, I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever. Again, the idea is those human beings that were glorious in life lose all of their glory in death. Right? They lose all their importance. Rulers and princes, all who had once worn kingly crowns and ruled the world in the days of old. We see that again a little bit further down. So the gods, they who stood in the place of the gods, like Anu and Enlil, so those people who were godlike before, right? They were kings. They now stood like servants to fetch food for others. So what is the worst possible thing for a king? A king is a person, or prince is a person who has authority over other human beings. They are the highest, right? Everyone else is their servant. What happens to them in the afterlife? They, like everyone else, they become servants for other people, right? Let's see, there's a little more here on that. Yeah. So again, it's the same idea. The kings lose their glory. They become servants in the afterlife, right? So if you think about what must be troubling Enkidu, why does he fear death? He doesn't fear death because he's afraid of it. He fears death because he does not want to go to a place where he can no longer do the things that would give him glory, right? So it would be no different for Enkidu or Gilgamesh, according to this notion of the afterlife, than for them to die or to be captured by another king and turned into a slave. These would be equivalent things, right? No difference. So it's not the actual death itself that concerns them. So Gilgamesh listens to him, and he listens to this dream about the afterlife, right? And Gilgamesh peeled off his clothes, he listened to his words, and he wept tears, quick tears, typical Gilgamesh. And he says, he opened his mouth and spoke to Enkidu, "Who is there in stronghold Uruk who has wisdom like this?" Nice confirmation for our thesis that wisdom has to do with dreams, right? Because all along, Enkidu wasn't the one who was called wise, it was Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh was the one all through the story who was receiving these kinds of dreams. And now Enkidu gets a dream, and the word wisdom immediately appears, right? As Gilgamesh saying, "Who has wisdom like this? Strange things have been spoken. Why does your heart speak strangely?" The dream was marvelous, but the terror was great. We must treasure the dream, whatever the terror, for the dream has shown that misery comes at last to the healthy man. The end of life is sorrow, right? Interesting little passage. The dream is marvelous, right? We must treasure the dream. But what does the dream really tell us? It tells us the end of human life is always sorrow, right? It's always going to this place, no matter how great you are as a human being. And this seems to be, something that was impressed. You see this in various ancient cultures and stories. They had these kings and like the pharaohs in Egypt who were regarded essentially as living gods, but there was always this one feature about them, which is that they always died just like other human beings. And that kind of contrast, right? Every normal human being dies, but to imagine that the almost godlike leader of your civilization, who is untouchable in so many ways and is glorified by the people, that they too eventually die just like everyone else. That seems to have been a very powerful experience that ancient peoples had, and we see that here, right? That in the dream that Enkidu has, the central idea is that the powerful become servants in the afterlife. Let's see. There's some other passages here that so he continues to die. His pain increases. Then he called out to Gilgamesh, "My friend, the great goddess cursed me, and I must die in shame." Right? Again, he's not expressing a fear of death. He's expressing a fear or a dissatisfaction with the fact that in the way he must die. Right? This actually makes everything very consistent. Earlier, Gilgamesh and Enkidu at various points were were fine with death, right? They were fine with death, but they were not fine with dying in a shameful way. They were fine with dying in battle, in glory, right? So if we understand that now the problem that Enkidu has with death is not death itself, but the manner of death, the kind of sad, shameful way in which he's dying, then it all makes very good sense. And he says that here. "My friend, the great goddess cursed me, and I must die in shame. I shall not die like a man fallen in battle. I feared to fall, but happy is the man who falls in battle, for I must die in shame." And Gilgamesh wept over Enkidu. We're going to see this, this is kind of surprising to us today, because a lot of us believe that kind of living at almost any cost is better than dying. But the ancients had quite a different experience of life and death for several reasons. One reason being that in ancient times, old age was considered a very almost shameful condition to be in, right? To be sickly, and of course they didn't have the medicine we do now. They couldn't alleviate a lot of the suffering that goes with old age. So people were not necessarily unhappy with... Huh? I could pause, yeah. I'm going to pause for a second because I need to get a drink. So I'll be right back.